Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com.
The educational ministry of Bethany Lutheran Church of Kerman, California supports this podcast through co-host Pastor Greg Camp. Church services are available on Zoom at www.bethanykerman.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another Scriptural Works podcast. I'm joined by two folks. Greg, my co-host, everyone knows. Greg, good to see you.
Good morning, Patrick. Great to be here this morning.
Likewise, and this is going to be a real treat because we're talking with Hemchand Gossai. He's on the East Coast, we're on the West Coast. It's early morning for us. It's a morning for him, I guess. Hemchand, this is going to be a great conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, absolutely. It's great to join both of you. Look forward to having this conversation about the topic that clearly has some serious currency.
Yes, definitely. You're spot on there. This is actually the inaugural show for our series on the 8th century prophets, Amos, Isaiah, Micah, and Hosea. Hemchand is going to cover a lot of that material. So we've intermixed a bunch of different questions because his research spans not only the 8th century, but other centuries as well. But going back to his dissertation, he spent a lot of time in these four prophets, and it's going to be a fascinating conversation. We actually are going to delve into some of the later iterations or redactions in the prophets as well, into the exilic and post-exilic periods as well at the end of the podcast, which adds a lot of color, I think, to what we're seeing happen in the 8th century. Before we get started, let's do a quick intro for Hemchand, because not everyone in our audience may be familiar with him. He is the Dean of Languages and Arts and Social Sciences at Northern Virginia Community College. He previously served as the Associate Dean of Liberal Arts at the same institution. He is an accomplished scholar. I mean, you look him up, look at his CV, it's a long, long list of really interesting but prestigious publications. He previously taught at Georgia Southern University as a professor and director of religious studies and at Muhlenberg College. He specializes in Hebrew Bible, ancestral narratives, Hebrew prophets, Holocaust memory, comparative gender in Bible, and social justice. As I noted, I didn't note yet, he holds a PhD in biblical criticism and Hebrew biblical hermeneutics from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Like the professor Greg and I studied with at Berkeley, he also studied over at St. Andrews, and actually my master's professor did as well under Matthew Black. So we have some connections there. He's authored, as I noted, a number of articles and books. His most recent book, which is very readable for ordinary audiences like me, I guess, if you want to spin it that way. And it's also quite affordable. It's not one of these Oxford, Cambridge, German books that cost, $299. I'm exaggerating slightly, but it's available on Amazon. Probably that's the best way to find it. To Take Heart from Despair to Hope in Turbulent Times. As I noted, it's a great read, and some of the conversation from today will come from it. He's also authored Justice, Righteousness, and Social Critique of the 8th Century Prophets, foundation for today's conversation. The Hebrew Prophets After Show, A Mandate for Change, Power and Marginality, and the Abraham Narrative. That's obviously sort of outside the scope of today's conversation. We'll have to have him back for that one. Baroness Blessing Abraham, Sarah, and the Journey of Faith. And Hemchand has a fascinating background. He was born in Iguana as a third-generation East Indian and has lived and studied in the United States and the United Kingdom. And I think he's actually written a book on, how he grew up. I think your mother died when you were young. And that also, I think, is available on Amazon if our audience is interested.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating stuff, Hemchand. So before we dive into the details, we could just have a podcast thing on your personal biography, and it would be an hour plus conversation. It would be probably more fascinating than 8th century prophets, I suspect. Before we get started, a quick ad from our sponsor. Are you ready to take your calling deeper? Abilene Christian University's Graduate School of Theology offers master's, doctoral, and certificate programs designed to equip ministers, scholars, and leaders for transformative service. Whether you're pursuing a Master of Divinity, a Doctor of Ministry, or a graduate certificate in practical ministry, Abilene Christian University's flexible online and on-campus options help you grow in faith and impact. Learn more at acu.edu/GST. That's acu.edu/GST. So with that, let's dive into the 8th century prophets. This is going to be a fun conversation, particularly with the events that we're seeing happen today, I think. So, Greg, why don't you kick us off?
Right. For our audience, Dr. Gossai's work focuses on two Hebrew terms that some of you may be familiar with: mishpat, justice, and tzedakah, righteousness, and the various forms of those words as they show up in the 8th century. And so in today's journey, we're going to look first at the 8th century world, where there is a lot of economic changes going on. There's rapid land consolidation into the hands of a few. There's the rise of the Assyrian Empire that's pushing down into this region of the world. The temple cults are going very strongly, both in the north and in the south, in Israel and in Judah. And there's a rapid development of the split between the privileged folks who are controlling most of this and those who are bearing the brunt of it. It always sounds so modern when we look at what's going on there. We're going to take a look at some specific passages. We'll look at Amos 5, Isaiah 1, and Isaiah 5 before jumping forward in time to look at how these themes make their way over towards the exile in Isaiah 58 and Jeremiah 29. But before we get into any of those verses, Hemchand, guide us through a little bit of what's happening on the ground, so to speak, in the 8th century. What's happening with some of the land seizure to get the consolidation of land, how debts are working to make this possible? Who are these, the wealthy class and so forth?
Yeah. And so, from the outside looking in, which in so many respects, I think we can relate to today. From the outside looking in, there's a kind of a gilded nature of the society. It's certainly in the Northern Kingdom, things are glorious. People seem to be doing well. People are worshiping more than ever. The markets in Samaria are full. The wealthy merchants are doing great. People are worshiping more than ever. The sanctuaries are full. And so to the casual observer, all is well, to use that frame of reference, except, of course, the more we begin to look, not with any kind of microscope, but even as we enter into the society, we realize that the only reason it looks that way from the outside is the kind of veneer that covers what is happening. And what is happening is really a marked divide between the powerful and the powerless, between the center and the margin, between the wealthy and, frankly, the poor. And within that category of the powerless and the poor, we find, frankly, the farmers, if you will, who are struggling, given the nature of what they're doing, to maintain the kind of livelihood that is, by any definition, basic. So, so we have these texts, for example, that in the 8th century that speak about the wealthy who are adding house to house and field to field where there is no one left to dwell except you are alone. So instead of having a land that will provide, you have maybe just a place that you can call home, but you're surrounded by a land that is no longer yours. You have to borrow, but you cannot pay back. And so you have this terrible cycle that is kind of like the vortex that begins and takes you deeper and deeper and deeper to the point where, in fact, we're not looking at sort of wealth. We're not looking at resources. We're looking at sustenance, daily sustenance. And in fact, from afar, it's not visible. But as you get into the lives of the people, which is exactly what the prophets are doing, it becomes apparent immediately that something is really wrong. Something is fractured. There is a fragmentation in the society. And what I would add quickly here, the four prophets are coming from different places, but they all converge at one place. And that, I think, is helpful. So we can't say that, well, that Amos guy, has a chip on his shoulder, which, by the way, he does. But we can say that that he has a chip on his shoulder, and therefore, because of his circumstance, being, a kind of a tender of sycamore trees in Tekoa, he's looking at all of the wealth, and because of he's maybe just jealous. No, we can't say that, because we have Isaiah, who is very much a kind of urbane, person who is dwelling into the city with the political class, and they are arriving at the same conclusion that this society is fractured, and in attending to that, you realize that you're betraying what is fundamentally a covenantal relationship that God has with the people. And so this is where I think all of these prophets, and then the later ones as well, Jeremiah and others, and Deuteronomy, Isaiah, enter into a similar kind of thing where all seems well, but all is not well.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like the fact that there's, as you just described, there's continuity across the centuries, across different prophets addressing a very similar situation. In this case, you have some of those four in the north, some in the south, some who are from the elite, some who, are just shepherds out, as you noted, tender the sycamore tree. So that's very interesting. And I suspect that's what got you interested in this topic in the first place, maybe, or what gave rise to that, which, got you homing in the dissertation you wrote, which was published, which we just mentioned, into this concept of justice and righteousness, as Greg alluded to. These are relationship concepts. Can you describe how those flow between all four of these prophets, and probably even outside of these prophets into other centuries?
Yeah, and that's the thing about it. And the way I would invite not just the three of us, but the way I would invite folks who are reading these texts to do so not only as an interesting sort of reminiscence of a time gone by, but rather what does this mean for us today? And for me, that is critical because these texts, as I think about it, are alive. These are live texts that we have to ask the question, what does this mean? And, one of my colleagues who sadly has passed away, but has been together with Walter Brueggemann, Terence Fretheim, well, my former colleague, who spent all of his years professionally teaching at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, would repeatedly say that his role was not to make the Bible relevant. He said, "I begin with the presupposition that this is relevant, or else what are we doing here, right?" So the question is, what does this mean? And I think as I look at our world, with the divisions that clearly are there between North and South, between East and West, but also within our society as a whole, within communities. I mean, you cannot be on Pennsylvania Avenue, you cannot be in Washington, D.C., and move within blocks of the White House and not realize that there is a dramatic divide there. And I think it's emblematic of a larger divide within our society between the have-nots, between the rich and the poor, between the one percenters and the rest of us. And when we read the prophets, both the 8th century and the later prophets, and realize that justice and righteousness over 1,000 times appear in these prophets and elsewhere as well, for sure, we realize that these are not terms that are occasional. These are foundational terms that have to do with the relationship. And so, Greg, to your point here, if our worship and our rituals, such as fasting, for example, which the prophet speaks about, does not have to do with the care of the poor, to give a voice to those who do not have a voice, then we have missed the mark, so to speak, which of course, as you know, is the word for sin. I mean, this is what I think reminds me again and again why these prophets and what they have to say really matters to us today. And it's difficult because, of course, it's not comfortable. It does not give us it does not make us feel warm and fuzzy. But the prophets did not ever come into the society to make people feel warm and fuzzy. That's not their role. No prophet comes into their community to say, I just want to let you guys know, nice job, keep it up. Okay, I thought I'd pop in to sort of confirm that all is well. No, they don't do that. But they also do not leave you only with an indictment. And I think it's helpful to know that there is an inherent quality and measure of grace and hope in the prophet. But it's not empty. We have to come to grips with the realities before we start looking at solutions.
Right. As you say, this relational side takes place not just interpersonally, but it involves these larger systems. As you mentioned about our own national situation, it involves money, it involves gender, sexuality, sex, power is part of this. And so there's a lot of exploitation that's going on economically, sexually, politically. Those things are all packed together. So unpack those for us. What's actually happening to families who are suffering under this? The prophets seem to be really good at naming the critique. They're a little bit shallow on what the solutions are. They're broad, but the critiques are rather pointed. So what are some of the things that they talk about specifically?
Well, certainly they talk about, if we're looking at land seizures, for example, they're very clear about this, but they're also clear about what that land seizure does to both the individual and to the family. That it becomes a crushing and devastating kind of blow because you cannot live. Maybe an example here. So what the prophets are saying is that you are seizing year after year after year, you're seizing the land. And then when the folks cannot repay the debt that they have borrowed, then of course it sort of perpetuates their dependency to the point where in fact they have nothing else to give. And we have this text that says they have even seized the cloaks that they're wearing. And as we know from Torah teaching, that in fact, whatever else you may take, you cannot take the cloak, the coat. That has to be left with the person as the last line of protection to ensure that they literally and figuratively are not stripped naked. So what the people have done is the accumulation of wealth that can by any measure be viewed as greed. I mean, it is never enough, to the point that, in fact, they are willing to take the coat off the backs of the people. And we have this sort of devastating picture of a father and a son going in front of the altar, drinking wine, and lying in front of the altar on the coats that they have taken. And that, it seems to me, is the indictment that encapsulates what is happening in the society. Because it is not so much that this is a business transaction and that, you have to repay what you have borrowed. This is a crushing of the poor. And Amos speaks about that, crushing of the poor into the dust of the earth. So it is not enough that we are having sort of an economic transaction here. What is happening is, in fact, we are crushing one sector of the covenant community. And in fact, by any measure, violating what is a core principle in the covenant relationship. And Mishpat and Tzedakah are, in my view, fundamentally relational terms. These are not just forensic terms. These are not just legal terms, even though occasionally it's translated acquittal and so on. These are fundamentally relational terms. And when we break that, we are undermining the relationship that is established between God and the people in a covenant relationship. This is what is, this is what's happening here. But the people are worshiping as much as ever.
Right.
You're going to Gilgal and to Bethel. You're giving you're giving twice a week. You're worshiping twice a week. And so we have this idea of the disconnect, because the people believe that their fundamental role is to simply go to temple, and maybe even the frequency of attendance in temple, maybe an exaggeration of all of the things that they can do by way of sacrifices, and that in and of themselves, those acts are enough. And the prophets are saying, no.
Hemchand, let's tie that to a specific passage. We've mentioned that we'll take a look at Amos 5, particularly at verses 18 to 24. And in this passage, Amos seems to be connecting those problems with worship with the day of the Lord. And Amos is telling them, stop longing for the day of the Lord. It's not what you think it is. So what does Amos do to flip their expectation of what this day of the Lord is? What do they think it is? And what is Amos going to say that it is? And how does it relate to their practices of worship?
Yeah, and we have a sense that the day of the Lord was a well-established sort of frame of reference of how God would act on behalf of the people. Now, we don't know exactly what constituted it. It could be, most scholars would say, well, it might have to do something with the agricultural yield or even a military sort of role.
Hmm.
But what we have, I think, is the idea that the people came to believe that God would always act on their behalf, and the day of the Lord will come as something that to which they're entitled. This is an entitlement, and so year after year, we expect that this will happen. And the prophet is saying, well, actually, the day of the Lord is not what you think it's going to be anymore. All right. In fact, the day of the Lord will bring darkness and not light. And you will not be able to escape from this darkness. Oh, by the way, you will run, and maybe a bear will chase you, and maybe you will escape, and maybe you will end up in a house. And I picture you, panting after escaping all of the dangers, and leaning against the wall, and there is a serpent waiting for you, right? There is no way to escape what is coming,
Hmm.
right? And what is coming is going to be devastating. Okay. And then the prophet, and so from 18 to 20, you have this total revamping of what the day of the Lord is, right? And Amos connects it, frankly, with worship. And what he says, and to my knowledge, I may be off here. I don't think I am, but
We don't think you are either.
but I'll leave it open. But I think it's the only place that I know of within the Hebrew scriptures that where God says, the prophet speaking on behalf of the Lord says, I hate and I despise. And it is used back to back with regard to worship. I hate and I despise what you're doing. I don't like the solemn assemblies. I don't like all of the sort of processions. I don't want all of your burnt offerings. I don't want your cereal offerings. I don't want any of that. I mean, I hate and I despise this stuff. And if the text ended there, I think we would be right to say, wow, so now what? But then we get what has become, I think, unfortunately, too much of a bumper sticker type statement. That is, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever flowing stream. And I think it's important for us that we do not allow a statement like that, which is a culmination of what God expects out of worship, to become just another kind of, this would be great to
Slogan.
put,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that we're careful, because justice and righteousness here have to be alive and cascade. I mean, there has to be force. It can't just be present. There has to be a force behind this. And if, in fact, you know, the culmination in verse 24 here begins with the vav, which of course could be most often translated, but let justice roll down like waters. Sometimes maybe it's helpful to use an and there, you know,
Hmm.
and maybe even as you worship, with all that constitutes your worship, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever flowing stream. But let me add something else here. Again, Amos is not the only one who is saying this. Uh, I mean, the Isaiah 1:10 to 17 text. If we think that Amos is too fierce and is too difficult for us to fathom, right? Then we have the opening chapter of Isaiah, which, in my view, is even more devastating,
Yeah.
because it begins with this idea of comparing the people to Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
And there is no explanation here, because the understanding is that you know exactly what happened with Sodom and Gomorrah. And I think, again, one of the dangers here, because of the nature of, maybe the nature of time and the nature of culture, that this Sodom and Gomorrah has essentially collapsed into, well, homosexuality.
Mm.
Except, of course, as they say, and the three of us having studied with folks who would remind us, when all else fails, read the text. Okay.
Yeah.
Read the text. Uh, by the way, your former professor Matthew Black uh, um, was at St. Andrews when I was there, and
So
he
was
was
he?
one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Carol Osborne, who I studied with in Abilene, studied under Matthew Black.
so
Yeah.
Matthew Black, and and Matthew Black and others would, I think, would say, when all else fails, let's go back to the text. And you read the text, and what was the sin in Sodom and Gomorrah? There is nothing about homosexuality. By the way, one could extrapolate. I get it, but there's one issue, and it was se'eka. It was se'eka, and the word, of course, means outcry. It's never spelt out, occasionally translated cry. The issue in Sodom and Gomorrah was an outcry. And as we begin to sort of look at this, we're discovering, by the way, that to compare to Sodom and Gomorrah means that there is clearly an outcry in the society. And the prophet goes on to outline this outcry in Isaiah 1 by talking about the social and political and economic injustices that have separated the people amongst themselves, but also have disconnected from how they worship and how they live.
Hmm.
And that disconnect cannot continue. And so Amos not only speaks in Amos 5, but Isaiah 1 outlines that. And they are, there's a verse in that text that says, uh, my soul hates what you're doing.
Hmm.
I mean, you know, we can throw around that idea in our common vernacular and not have to unpack it. But when the prophet is saying the soul of God hates what you're doing, by the way, what is, I mean, to me, I don't know that there is anything that is more devastating as as an indictment
Hmm.
when the soul
Yeah.
of God, and then it proceeds to say, I will close my eyes and I will shut my ears. In other words, I don't want to see you and I don't want to hear you, because the hands, and if ever we're wondering if this stuff has sort of connection with today, the hands that you pray with, and we have this line here, are full of blood.
Hmm.
And then it says, wash your hands, make yourselves clean, seek justice, defend the widow, plead for the orphan. The connection between what you do and how you pray, to me, has to have, I mean, it has to be indelibly connected with the least among us. And so we see this theme again and again in the prophets. And it's framed maybe somewhat differently from time to time, but once we look at the text, it all comes down to, again, the way society is divided and the connection between what you do in worship and how you live.
Hmm. Hmm. Direct
So,
ethical implications, right? Today.
yeah.
Well, let's jump forward a couple chapters to chapter 5 in Isaiah. For
Mhm.
those who are following along in your Bibles, your Old Testaments, Hebrew Scriptures, Hemchand was referring to Isaiah chapter 1, 10 through 17, for whatever it's worth. And I was going to read it, but he pretty much explained it all. So I don't think
He did.
reading it's going to add any more detail beyond what Hemchand just described. So Hemchand, when we go to 5, it starts out like you have this very, very graphic detail happening in chapter 1 and some of the subsequent chapters. Then we get to 5, it starts almost like a love song. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. But then it turns into a courtroom litigation, if you may, where you have a woe against the land consolidation in particular. Can you connect, what happens at the beginning of 5, 5, 1 through 7, that love song, with what happens in 5, 8?
Sure, and it's interesting because it begins as a love song, and more as we look at the opening of that text, Pat. It's a song about love. So we don't want folks to read it, as some kind of contemporary love song. This is a song about love. This is what, if you want to know what love means, let me tell you what love means.
Hmm.
And by the way, and in the process, I'm going to tell you also what it's not. So I'm going to begin by framing a love story. And again and again, of course, we see within Scripture the use of the vineyard as a metaphor. And so
Yeah.
what we have here is the song of the vineyard, as it's called, is the preparation that goes into this vineyard. Every single item that would make for this vineyard to be fruitful is meticulously prepared. But we also have a wine vat at the end of this. In addition to, we have, of course, a tower to overlook this, right? We have a house to overlook, so to keep out, if you will, maybe the animals and so on. But we also have a wine vat. And I focus on that because there's an expectation here. This is not, it's hope, but it's not only an empty kind of hope. There's an expectation because according to the prophet, all of the choice vines have been planted here. But then the time came for a harvest when everything has been invested. And most of the translations say sour grapes. Um, uh, one of my colleagues, again in St. Andrews, who wrote a little bit about this before my time. I shouldn't say he was a colleague; he was not a contemporary of mine. Um, Talks about the fact that this word should really be translated as rotten. He said the idea of sour suggests that the grapes are still good, maybe not used in the same way. Okay, but he said these are rotten grapes. There is nothing
They're not
good
useful.
about
Yeah.
this. And then what do? I will tear it down, and it culminates with the fact that I will rain no rain upon this. Now, maybe human beings could tear down fences. Maybe we could start over. Maybe we could, plant a new vineyard. Maybe get a different species. But when it says, I will rain no rain upon it, it becomes abundantly clear that the prophet is saying that the only person who controls this is God. God will ensure that this will be destroyed. And then, in case the people didn't quite get it, because remember, sometimes we project that this has to be for someone else. It can't be for us, surely. I mean, this we have a relationship, we worship, we go to the temple often, we give sacrifice, we make sacrifices, we have off. So what is this story is about? And then it says, oh, by the way, I'm speaking to you, Judah. I'm speaking to you, Israel. And then we have the culmination in verse 8, where you have had house to house and field to field, and there is no one left. And God looked, and then there's this magnificent play on words. And I think it's instructive because it says God looked for Mishpat, but found Mishpach. And God looked for Sedekah, but found Seekah. And so you change one letter and everything changes. God looked for justice and instead found bloodshed. And there we can think of bloodshed, not it's kind of like the Isaiah 1 text, right?
Mm-hmm.
When your hands are full of blood, this is not an invitation for us to say, well, I think I'm okay here. No, to find bloodshed is how we destroy those within us who are members of this covenant community in a variety of ways, politically, economically. And then I look for tzedakah, the righteousness to hold us in relationship in the broadest possible way. And all I can find is an outcry, which, by the way, is the same word that is used in the Sodom and Gomorrah story.
Right.
Okay. And so this is, again, a good reminder that this is not, I looked for tzedakah, but there is, homosexuality. This is a much larger systemic issue. I am looking for a society that is predicated on righteousness and justice. And I'm finding bloodshed in the form of the crushing of your neighbor and their land. And I'm
So
finding the outcries. Right.
yeah, so Hemchand, you mentioned that the vineyard serves as a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the nation as a whole, but it's also one of the chief economic drivers. The vineyards are, and so is he using this in almost a double entendre way? This is who you are, but it's also your economic system. Is he attacking the economic order itself? It seems like you're pushing that way. That it's the estate building, the debt system, the courts. Is the economic system itself become the idol for the people?
I think, and I think this is an important, maybe even kind of a critical issue in our society as well, because
Mhm.
a lot of folks, right, would like to think that what these prophets are saying on other texts within the Bible are alluding to have to do with the individual. Well, we have one bad player out here, or we have one, but actually, I think this is the systemic issue.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
system itself is such that there are some who control what happens to the lives of the masses. And so this is not just one or two individuals who need to get their act together. So here's an example maybe that could serve a little bit of an analog. When Amos, we are told, most scholars, I think, uh, would would say that Amos had one shot at preaching, right? So he was not the prophet who came back again and again and again, right?
Hmm.
He had one shot. It was in
Yeah.
the temple.
Right.
It was in worship, clearly, right? And
Mhm.
evidently he disappeared and went back to tending sycamore trees. But in there, probably for his own life. But yeah, but in there, he was asked to leave.
Mhm.
And he was asked to leave by the priest because we cannot, our our hearts essentially cannot take the message that you're bringing to us, right? So leave and take your message elsewhere. And then the priest says, because this temple is the king's temple. And so what we have, I think, there and elsewhere is the collapsing of the sort of the line between worship, between the role of the priest and the prophet,
Mhm.
and society. Okay, these the priest has entered into a kind of alliance, if you will, with the powers that be. And so, rather than
Hmm.
allow a message to challenge what is happening, let's kill the messenger. Let's get rid of the messenger. Right away. Again, not a new idea. Look what happened
Mhm.
with Elijah, right?
Yeah.
The guy ran for his life because a king would not, and to be fair, the queen as well, right? They
Yeah.
were, yeah, who in some respects probably was even more notorious,
Mhm. Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
they wanted no part of him. And same with Micaiah ben Imlah before that. So we have precedents here that the system would not tolerate the prophetic word that
Mhm.
would challenge what is happening systemically. So it's more, you're absolutely right about this, Greg. This is not just about individuals.
Mhm.
Yes, there is that. This is about the collapsing of a system that should protect and care and bring together all of the universal qualities that hold us together as a community, as a covenant community, as a human community.
Mhm.
And that has collapsed between us and them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Now,
Yeah.
we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that we're going to look at some exilic, post-exilic, prophetic writings at the same time. So we picked out two: Isaiah 58 and Jeremiah 29. Jeremiah obviously is very popular, but hard to get your arms around because of the chronological sequencing that happens. And I think Greg just got through teaching Jeremiah at church,
Yeah.
and he tried to sort all that out. If he figured it out, I would need to hear his conclusion.
I had to
But
use somebody else's reconstruction of that.
But if we fast forward, we're talking, 8th century, we go to the end of the 6th century, beginning of the 5th century, or 7th century, beginning of the 6th century is where we're at with Jeremiah and Deutero Isaiah. People are in exile or they're living off of foreign power. Um, as Hemchand said, these aren't brand new ideas. These are ideas that span multiple centuries, and they're sort of an extension of the 8th century message here at the close of the 7th century and the beginning of the 6th century. If we look at Jeremiah 29, it's a letter to the exiles in Babylon. Many are probably familiar with it. If you read it, if not, get your Bibles out and take a look at it. Uh, Everyone quotes, as Hemchand said, that other line back in Isaiah is frequently cited. Well, this is another one of those. It's a feel-good line that's taken out of context. I know the
Mhm.
plans I have for you, but the letter itself is confrontational. When we look at 29 Hemchand, what are we, what's playing out here, and tell us what this favorite line that everyone picks out plucks out of 29 actually
Yeah.
means in its context.
Well, and again, I have plans for you, right? And it's sort of in time, the plans will sort of emerge what my plans are for you. But, it's kind of like, again, it's like the Amos text, let justice roll down like waters. We take that, plaster it on the wall. It's like the Micah 6 text. What does the Lord require of you? You know, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly. By the way, fantastic. But what we miss is, of course, what leads to those moments.
Mhm.
In the Jeremiah 29, this is for me. This is an extraordinarily painful letter, but
Mhm.
it's also a
Yeah.
letter that really has, I think, it really frames the essence of what we need then and now. And so the people are in exile, okay? But you
Mhm.
also have a prophet who is preaching peace, essentially kind of an ancient, even more ancient version of Julian of Norwich idea. All is well, all will be well, okay? Hananiah is telling the people, all is well, all is well. You know, there is peace. Don't listen to that guy. I mean,
Mhm.
given the choice between a prophet such as Jeremiah, who is taking you to task given what is happening, and Hananiah, who is saying, all is well. Okay,
Mhm.
you can begin to see where the challenge is. And what Jeremiah says in that letter, to me, it is encapsulated with his statement that in exile, right? First of all, you will be there for a while.
Mhm.
Build houses, have children, have your children marry, right? Plant, you know, trees, and then the fruit of those trees. And then he says, seek, in the New Revised Standard Version says, seek the welfare of your captors, for in their welfare you will find your welfare. And that
Hmm.
statement, which of course the Hebrew in there as 3 times, is seek the shalom of those who captured you, for in their shalom you will find your shalom. What Jeremiah is saying is that your existence and identity while in exile is not just tethered, but in fact it is absolutely inseparable from those who have taken you in exile. We grew up with this. It's rubbing salt in your wound.
Mhm. Mhm.
You are already in exile, and the prophet is saying the only way to counter the militaristic impulse of the ones who taken you into exile is to seek peace for yourself, but it's going to be predicated on your care of those with whom you live.
Hmm.
Okay? And that, for me, is one of the core ideas. Yes, there's, of course, tons in Jeremiah, but if you are
Mhm.
going to survive, you have to seek the shalom of those with whom you live. And I think it's a kind of a broad extension of love your
Mhm.
enemies. Okay, I
Mhm.
know that's a
Hmm.
throwaway line, right? Right? But this is it here. Seek the shalom of those. And we know that the people didn't want to do this.
Yeah.
We know that, and we see if to sort of connect Psalm 137, where there's some taunting going on here.
Mhm.
Sing us one of them songs, right? Songs like a line out of Blazing Saddles. Okay, yeah, sing us one of them songs. You know the
Blast from the
song.
past.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
yes, yeah. It's not going to make any difference to 18-year-olds today. But sing us one of those songs, and then
Mhm.
you have this. But can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And actually, I think the question is meant to say, well, no, we can't. But actually, the answer is yes, you can.
Mhm.
It doesn't
Mhm.
mean that it's easy, but yes, you can, and
Yeah.
you must. But here's what I'd really like to do. I'd really like to let the people know how angry and hurt I am by
Mhm.
smashing their children's head against the rocks. But you don't. You can't. Instead, seek the peace.
Mhm.
And this, I think, is for me a critical message uh, in the time of the exile, but now, frankly, 3,000 years later,
Mhm.
right? How do we seek the peace and live in peace with those that we might deem to be our enemy.
Yeah.
And this is the stuff that we're waking up to day after day after day. How do we seek the shalom? That's one of my friends at the church where we worship, and I was leading some studies here, and he's a retired pastor uh, from a Lutheran church from Alexandria, Virginia, and he came and he said before Christmas, he said, "I'm going to give you an assignment, Hemchand. I want you to come up. I give you 2 weeks, and I want you to come up with a word for shalom that is not peace." And
Well,
and he said the reason is it's become just another word. You
Yeah.
know, it's just um, uh,
It's been diluted.
we want, yeah, it's
right,
diluted. We want
right.
peace, but what does that mean? And I realized I was thinking about it, and we don't really have a word except shalom. Yeah,
Yeah,
we can think of concord, we can think of harmony, but it's not going to go anyplace.
yeah,
But so seek the shalom of those with whom you live, including those that you have deemed the enemy
yeah.
and your captors. The bar is very high.
Yeah, it's not surprising that Jeremiah ended up on the king's watch list and eventually tossed down a well to keep him silent and out of public eye there. And
Well,
this is
and,
part of the challenge of going into exile and learning to accept that this is God's judgment and that God's doing something. But let's fast forward a little bit more to when the people come back. So Isaiah is, it's a very complicated piece. And starting with chapter 40, it looks like it's a period of time where they're coming back. By the time we get to 58, it's like the people are back in the land, but life isn't going well. All right, we've suffered under these captors. We've now returned. We're wanting to be faithful. God, why aren't you listening to us? We're fasting and praying, and you're not paying any attention. Walk us through what Isaiah 58 is about.
yeah.
Are the people really fasting and praying and asking God? And why isn't God answering? Or why do they not see this answer?
So here's how I would think about this. um, I think that uh, memory, for example, is a critical part of helping us live today with an understanding that, in fact, there are those who've gone before us. There are experience of those who've gone before us. There are judgments that have gone before. Or a memory of those, at least in large part, have to do so that we don't repeat that. Okay. In some respects, when I read 58, I think that the folks have lost track of any kind of memorial. That is to say, in a way, if we are blindfolded and we took sections of 58 out of a Deutero-Isaiah context, and we take that and we put it along Amos 5 or Isaiah 1,
Right.
we would find this remarkable sort of parallel
Mm-hmm.
because the folks are worshiping. And so what do I do in Isaiah 58? I'm fasting. And what I would like for you to tell me as I fast is that, what a guy. I'm, you know, how's your fast going? And I get the public kind of, if you will, acknowledgement of my own vested interests in matters that are in ritual matters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But what does that have to do with justice? What the prophet is saying, that every ritual that you perform that might lead you to believe that in and of itself it is an end, and therein lies the challenge. The people repeatedly believe that worship and sacrifice was an end in and of itself, and the prophets kept reminding them it is not an end in and of itself. Okay, what you do in the context of worship, howsoever extravagant that might be, right, has to have uh, uh, not just a passing marginal connection. It has to have a principal connection with how you live with the community, how you function in the community, how you care for the poor, how you care for the oppressed, how you act on behalf of those who have no voice. This is why your fasting matters. This is why your offering matters. This is why your sacrifice matters. If those things become an end in of themselves, to put it somewhat bluntly, they become idolatrous. That's what it is, because you begin to worship those things in and of itself. And I think, I know this is a leap here, but I think of Mary's Magnificat.
Mm-hmm.
It begins right with this remarkable self sense of who am I, and immediately launches into what is this extraordinary statement about the oppressed. This is why, essentially, I'm called to be as a lowly servant. It has to matter. And the prophets repeatedly mention this again. I mean, again and again and again. And I will say one other quick, make another quick point. Think of think of Micah 6. Okay. Again, we have this court scene, and the Hebrew is the same Hebrew word, reef. It's a lawsuit. And you have this court scene, so to speak, with this kind of gut-wrenching feeling of God as a parent, and says, what is it that I have done to you that you would act this way? Didn't I send Moses and Aaron, and Miriam? Didn't I deliver, why would you do this? And the response of the people is exclusively wrapped up in sacrifices with a kind of a sarcastic overtone. What do you want from me? Do you want burnt offerings? How about, calves a year old? How about 1,000, rams? How about 10,000 rivers of oil? How about the firstborn for the sin of my soul? It's an escalation of giving, of sacrifice, but never once connecting what you do with how you live. The people saw that what they did with the sacrifices in and of themselves was enough. That's all we need. That's it.
Yeah.
I really like this concept, or I guess the language that you use. You alluded to this earlier. The veneer of piety, and then you also, in some of the writings you've done, you talk about the sacrifice of the stranger. That goes hand in hand. It's very illustrative of what you just described.
Right.
And there is a veneer of piety. I mean, we see it today. There's frankly, painfully to acknowledge, there's a branch of the evangelical movement today that is really sort of um, painted this veneer over everything else to justify what is clearly unjustifiable. And ultimately, to paraphrase Hosea, there will come a day when this will be stripped naked and the world will see.
Yeah, Hemchand, as we've looked at Amos 5 and Isaiah, a couple of places in Isaiah 1 and 5 and 58 and Jeremiah 29, and you've noted how we like to take certain lines and turn them into bumper stickers or some magnet on our refrigerator, and completely miss the point of what these passages are about. Can you draw out for us, I won't say a single line. I don't want another thing on my refrigerator. It's covered plenty so far. But can you bring these passages together for us and what you think they're ultimately saying?
I know this would sound far too simple, so we go with the, as they say, the simplest solution, so to speak. I think these passages get to the heart of what it means for us to be a neighbor with and to each other. And the onus is on us. And so the examples that I would give, we think, for example, of the so-called Good Samaritan, right? Which is a very derogatory way to think of Samaritans, of course, right? But stopping to help an anonymous person when the religious folks wouldn't, right? We don't know the identity of the person, and it doesn't matter. And it's important because that parable begins with the the man of law asking, "What do I need to do?" Right? Who is my neighbor? And Jesus turns that question around at the end in a dramatic reversal and says, "It is not who is my neighbor, but who are you going to be a neighbor to?" That's the question. And I think all of the prophets are saying, be a neighbor because your identity is absolutely connected with each other. Okay, so contemporary examples, that's an old example from the Bible. Think of King. Why would Martin Luther King go to Memphis, Tennessee to march and to demonstrate with the sanitation workers? He's not a sanitation worker. He's not from Memphis. These are neighbors that, well, they're far away geographically, but it doesn't matter. And kind of like Elijah and kind of like Jeremiah, you could put your life on the line, which of course, as it turns out, the next day he's assassinated. Or why would Mother Teresa dedicate her life for the people who are literally in the gutters with no one to care for them, the so-called untouchables, where your own family would not touch you. Okay. Again, not because you're Christians or Catholic or Protestant. No, because that is the human factor that enters into what it means to be a neighbor. So, what I would say is that let us try as much as possible to become better every day at being, a covenantal neighbor with each other, regardless of our circumstances, our station in life, or our status in society, regardless of our gender, regardless of our wealth, and collapse the bridge that has been dividing both the margin and the center. Ultimately, the center cannot hold by itself, as we well know. And I think
Yeah.
that is part of our challenge. Who will we be a neighbor to?
Yeah.
What a
And as you
wonderful
say,
summary. Go
yeah,
ahead.
and that even includes as you mentioned earlier, the neighbor to those in Babylon who brought you captive there.
Absolutely.
That takes it to a whole
Absolutely.
different level of trying to be neighbor.
Well, and what's interesting is, what Hemchand just described. We've had that conversation with Joel. We had that conversation with Joshua. We talked about his new book on the theology of Acts. And we actually have a podcast on the Good Samaritan, speaking of that, right? That
Right.
talks about all the issues that Hemchand just discussed, actually from the vantage point of the unnamed wounded man in the ditch, which was a fascinating conversation. So
Right.
There's a lot of continuity between all our different podcast episodes, ironically. Hemchand, what's next? You have this book, which we're obviously going to advertise with the podcast. We're going to put it down as a link at the bottom. Make sure if you're in the audience, you check that out. As I said, it's very accessible. It's very readable. You get his thoughts both in terms of what was happening in the 8th century, along with other biblical facets, but what that means for today, which he talked a bit about just now. But what's on the roadmap, Hemchand? What's next in terms of research and writing for you?
I'm working on this I'm working on this manuscript that has to do with teaching, which sounds like, something that's going to be published with 5 easy ways to become a good teacher, but it's not that. It's not that. Sort of the working title is, teaching as benediction, where we begin with what is the good word here, literally. So developing the idea about teaching that really has to have a moral component to it, with an understanding that all of our students who enter into our classrooms, particularly for the first time, come as strangers. And what does it mean before we begin to teach about a discipline? What does it mean for us to have a presence in that classroom, which is going to be the first connection that we make with our students, and likely one of the things that they will remember in time to come. So I'm much more interested these days in benediction than eulogies. So I wonder. Eulogies will come, but while we have a moment, I want to deal with the benediction.
Well said. Yeah. Well,
Yep.
This has been a fascinating conversation. It's a wonderful way to start our series on the 8th century prophets, and we have some really interesting episodes coming up that take where Hemchand got it started and then elaborate specifically in regards to some of the 4 prophets that we just talked about, and then we have a couple that are on specific themes as well. So watch for those as they're coming out. And as we mentioned, there's other wonderful podcasts that we produced. They're produced in different episode series. This is one on the 8th century prophets, as you know, but there's one on the ending of the Gospels and Acts. There's one that we're just wrapping up actually on the marginalized, outcast characters in specifically the book of Acts, and a few instances in Luke, and how those emerge, and how there's a reversal. There's essentially a subverting of standard stereotypes that exist from a reader standpoint, which is really interesting. So make sure you check those out at on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or you can simply go to our website, scriptureworks.com. Hemchand, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Greg. This was delightful. Thank you. I appreciate
Absolutely.
it.
Thank you.
Take care.
For other podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-hosts Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests, visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels.